Hi, this is Dave Winkler with Naval Historical Foundation Naval History Book Review Author Chats. And today we have Captain Marc Liebman. He is the author of the recently published Raider of the Scottish Coast. It is a historical fiction. Before we get there, let's talk a little bit about Captain Liebman. He was commissioned in 1969. Nearly 6,000 hours in helicopters, fixed wing, had active duty service in reserve duty, served in Vietnam all the way through Desert Storm, which 30 years ago. Outside of the Navy, he was a former chief executive officer of the Aerospace Defense Manufacturing Company, and he's been a consultant to some of our allies overseas. This is not his first book. He is in the techno thriller genre, kind of like Kevin Miller, who we interviewed earlier this year, who wrote the Silver Waterfall about the Battle of Midway, and he has a new book coming out, the Slusher Island Incidents. It's about it's dealing with North Korea. It's coming out next month. I think you'll want to take a look at it. But what we're going to talk about today is something totally different. He's gone back about 240 years with his Raider of the Scottish Coast. And with that, what we'll do is we'll ask him, why did he get into this age of sail? There he is. So, hello, Marc. So talk to us a little bit about what drove you to go into a area where you would have strong comfort zone, given your naval aviation background, because there's connections with your story, your techno thriller fiction works with your lifelong experience to go all the way back 240 years to go into this new genre. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, if the truth be known, the origins of the book is a dinner conversation between my publisher, my wife, and I, and his senior editor. And his name is Michael James. He's ex-SAS, and he has several authors who write age of sail fiction. And he says to me at dinner, have I ever thought of writing an age of sail novel? And since I grew up reading C.S. Forrester, Alexander Kent, Patrick O'Brien, and all those guys, I said, no, but I'd love to do that. So the dinner conversation went on, and my mind was literally racing with the possibilities of this. So we went home, and actually we went back to our RV, which is in Tucson, and I literally that night and the next day wrote out what I call the plot summaries. It's kind of like, this is when it's going to take place, this is kind of what the character's going to be, and this is what the plot's about. Trust me, I've written the first three, and they're not all like that, but that was close enough. So I sent those to Michael, and he said, get started. And he says, I'll buy them. And I went, great. So we signed a contract for Raider of the Scottish Coast plus 3 more, okay? And so I've delivered Raider of the Scottish Coast, came out this past summer. I expect the second book in the series to come out sometime middle of next year, the third one about 6 months, 7 months later, et cetera. But there's now going to be 6. So this gets to another question on your list is, what did I do? Why did I do this, and how did I make a difference, so to speak? Well, if you look at all the Age of Sail novels, not all, but probably I'm going to guess 80 to 90% of them, they all focus on the Royal Navy, and they focus on the Napoleonic era, which is essentially after the French Revolution, when Napoleon starts doing his thing, up to about the fall of Napoleon. So that's let's say 1800 to 1815.
Right.
Nobody or very few people write about this thing called the Continental Navy, which, by the way, is a separate and distinct organization of the United States Navy, which I didn't realize until I did the research. So what I did is I took a midshipman joining the Continental Navy. So he's a young man, he's 16. But I also decided to throw a little twist in it. So I've got the second major character, kind of 1B, is Darren Smythe. So you have Jaco Jacinto from Charleston, South Carolina, joins the Continental Navy at age 16. Well, Over here in the east, in town of Gosport, which is opposite Portsmouth, you have Darren Smythe. And from time he was a little boy, he used to sit on a rock overlooking the harbor, watching ships go back and forth, dreaming of becoming a Royal Navy captain. So he decides not to join his family business and join the Royal Navy, goes to what at the time was known as the Royal Naval Academy. And voila, in 1773, he's now a midshipman and in the Royal Navy. So the whole idea of this series is their paths start as mortal enemies. And in Raider of the Scottish Coast, they actually meet. I won't tell you how they meet, but they meet and they become friends. And they actually become good friends because there's a lot of similarities in their backgrounds. Jaco comes from a relatively wealthy family in South Carolina. The Smythes are relatively wealthy in Gosport. They're both naval officers. They both want to serve their countries. They're both within a year and a half each other, or 2 years, let's say, in age. So they become good friends. Well, then Darren has parole. He's back in the Royal Navy. Jaco is now a captain on a Continental Navy ship, and now they're mortal enemies again. So this interweaving of their lives is going to continue throughout the entire series. So at one time they're going to be friends, and other times they're going to be mortal enemies. And so that's the gist of the characters and the storyline.
Which is kind of an interesting twist, because typically in these Age of Sail novels, the featured character is a captain or a leader, and you're looking at it really from a bottom-up perspective.
Correct.
So, yeah, so that's going to offer. But as far as integrating it into the actual history of the time, I was skimming through, and quite an interest. You're talking a lot, for example, John Paul Jones, the Providence, which is now a museum, a replica of it's now here in Alexandria. So how do you actually integrate their storylines with the actual history, and how did you go about doing that research?
Well, okay, so I'm going to start with the disclaimer that I tell everybody when they read the book, which is simply this: this book was the absolute hardest thing I've ever written in my life. I had told the publisher that I figured I'd have the first manuscript in 6 months, and he said, "Great." He says, "When it's ready to go, we'll start the process." Well, it took me a year. But I found a great many really good sources, one of which is the Naval Documents of the American Revolution, which is available through the Navy's Heritage Command. And it's fascinating reading. In fact, it's a rat hole. You can spend hours and hours reading and not get what you want. But I found things like letters between Joseph Hughes and John Adams, where they are arguing, I'm using that term loosely, about who should be a captain and why. Hughes wanted to promote people who, based on merit, essentially, and Adams wanted to appoint his friends from Boston who are merchant ship captains. Well, as John Paul Jones, as I found again reading, one of the reasons he was brought in, and one of the reasons that a guy by the name of Biddle and a couple other guys, John Barry, were brought in, was because they had Royal Navy experience. And Jones was, and Biddle and Barry were pretty adamant about merit counts. We're going to grow our own, and to be a naval officer is different, or being a successful naval officer is different than being a successful merchant ship captain. So that's one thing. The second thing, I started reading history, and so I read books like Feeding Nelson's Navy to learn what the hell they ate. Okay. Because I had to transport myself back into the 1700s. There's no internet, there's no GPS, there's no electricity, there's no computers, there's no streets, there's no restaurants per se. Yes, there were inns, but there's no supermarkets. I mean, it was a totally different world, or was a totally different world. So you have to transport yourself back and begin to figure things out as they did. So there's a couple other interesting things you had to deal with. So I found this wonderful book written in 1855 called Naval Gunnery. Okay, granted, it's 50 years later, but he has things in there like effective ranges of different size shot against different kinds of targets. So you can kind of extrapolate that back. Now, I happen to be interested in firearms, so that was relatively easy. But and as someone who has sailed pretty much all his life, I'm talking about sailboats like sloops, I learned very quickly that sailing a square rigger is another world. So that led me to reading books like A Young Sea Officer's Sheet Anchor, and probably the best was by John Harlan. It's called The Seamanship in the Age of Sail. I read other ones. I probably spent $500 to $800 in books just to research this, and a lot of I didn't read them all, read them cover to cover, but I read the parts that were appropriate to what I was researching at the time. So then I started coming across tidbits like, and this is my favorite one, is who's the first guy who mapped and plotted relatively accurately the Gulf Stream? Well, I'll save you the answer to look it up. It's in the book. It's none other than Benjamin Franklin.
Okay.
He used information from friends of his who are sea captains, merchant ship captains, and fishermen, and plotted what we now know as the Gulf Stream. He called it Gulf, G-U-L-P-H. And he actually did it when he was the Postmaster General for North America, living in London. He takes it to Royal Mail saying, look, if we use this thing, we can reduce the transit times back and forth across the Atlantic. And Royal Mail said, nah, it's a bunch of fishermen and Americans, what the hell they know. And the Royal Navy wouldn't even talk to him about it. It's a bunch of damn colonials. In fact, there's a quote in their book about exactly what a Royal Navy admiral said to Benjamin Franklin. So what I did is I took a lot of historical data, bits, timing, and that's what paced the book. So the first part of the book is Jones of Providence and the raid down in, actually the raid in Nassau that was botched by Hopkins. And then the Providence's cruise to Canso, where Jones took a bunch of prizes. So I put the Jacinto there. And then from that point on, the book is, I follow the timeline of the American Revolution, but I created a fictitious ship. And I'll talk about Scorpion in a second. On the British side, I did the same thing, except rather than use real ships, and I actually tracked a couple of ships with their deployment schedules. So I had a good idea how what their size. I created fictitious frigates based on various classes of Royal Navy frigates of that era. So I created this fictitious ship after reading papers and letters between this guy by the name of James Hackett and Joshua Humphreys. Now, both of them were shipwrights or shipbuilders at the time. Both were forward thinkers, and both had some pretty good ideas. And most of those ideas wound up in this class of ships that we now know as the 6 frigates: Constitution, Constellation, United States, Macedonia, etc., Chesapeake, Congress. But so he came up with 5 different ideas separately, and they were incorporated over time, ultimately in Constitution. But so one of which, and the most important one of which, is the use of what I call layered armor. Now, it's not like we use today, but Humphreys came up with the idea of using hard New England or South Carolina oak, sandwiching it with soft pine, backed by a 3rd layer of oak. Well, what happens is the oak gets hit with a cannonball, the pine compresses, but doesn't penetrate. So you have no spall. Okay, so that was one. Another one was the use of a tapered hull and a narrower bow. And if you're a marine engineer, you know that if you taper the hull beyond the midsection, the ship reduces the amount of drag. Well, they didn't know about drag in those days, but they knew that, but experiments told them that this worked. Well, the one thing that Humphreys didn't get right was the bow. That came later after the 1800s, but I put the raked bow in. So you have the raked bow and the narrower hull, and suddenly you have a ship that's 3 or 4 knots faster than the bad guys, the Royal Navy. And they say, well, 3 or 4 knots, that's not very much. Well, in that era, 3 or 4 knots is like a 30% delta.
Yeah.
So then they started playing around with what they called the long guns. And again, if you read the book like the Guns of the Constitution, you read about some other things. The Continental Navy started playing around with the long 9 and then the long 12. Okay, what they did is essentially add 2 feet to the barrel. Okay, they didn't have ways to calculate the muzzle velocity, but it didn't take a rocket scientist if you fired it against a sample hull to see that a long 12 had greater muscle velocity, and when the ball hit, had greater energy. So I included that on the ship. So now you had a ship that was technically superior, faster, and had guns that could outrange the Royal Navy. So that was part of the research. Yes, I understand the ship is fictitious, but it makes for a good story. When I get to the next generation books past the Revolution, again, I'm going to take what they did with Constitution and those ships, and do the same thing.
So the long term is to take this, I guess, towards the War of 1812.
Yes. So the next book is Carronade, followed by Death of a Lady. The book that takes place during the Quasi War is called For a Few Francs. The war against the Barbary pirates is called Fight We Shall. These are all working titles.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last one, Powder, takes place in the War of 1812, is Powder and Shot.
Okay. But before they read all that, they have to go ahead and read this book. And so tell me, how would you go about getting this? I know you have a website. Is there a publisher website?
Yeah, there's basically 5 places to get it. You can buy it from me through my website. I'll sign it. I get a credit card over the phone and ship it to you. You can buy it through my publisher, but it is basically links right to Amazon, which is the third one. Barnes & Noble you can order from, and through BookBub. 5 most common ways to do it. I have paid all those sites.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. And this concludes another edition of Naval Historical Foundation Author Chats.